Good afternoon. The webcast will begin shortly. We'll just give another minute or two to allow people to dial in. Thanks, and we'll be back with you shortly. All right, I think we'll give it a start now. So hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. My name is Jose Clavijo, and I'm a lead analyst with Refinitiv Agricultural Research, and I'll be your moderator for today. Before we begin, there are a few housekeeping rules I'm going to go over briefly. First is that the webcast is recorded, and we will email the slide deck out to all the registrants and attendees at the end. You can also use the widgets on your console to interact with us. So for instance, you can submit questions anytime by hitting the purple Q&A box, and we will answer the questions at the end of the presentation. But really feel free to submit a question anytime. And for any technical help, click the yellow question mark button. And there are other resources and helpful tips right at the end there on those console buttons in case you need anything. All right. First, before we get started, just a very quick note about Refinitiv. Yeah, you may already know us, but we were formerly the financial and risk business of Thomson Reuters. Refinitiv is one of the world's largest providers of financial markets data and infrastructure. And so to learn more about us, please go to refinitiv.com. Now, without further ado, I am going to introduce our speakers for today. First of all, our moderator, Karen Brown. Karen Brown is a global agriculture columnist for Reuters. She also has a background in meteorology, and in her work at Reuters, she focuses on all aspects of the global agriculture market, predominantly in the grains and oilseed space. The second person I'd like to introduce is Matt Bennett. He's a farmer, former grain elevator owner from Illinois, and he is also Channel Seed's grain marketing consultant and holds a Series 3 brokerage license and is a founding partner of agmarket.net. Today, he's going to bring a producer perspective to our discussion and really enrich this with his extensive grain marketing background. Next, we have Dr. Seth Nave. He was born and raised on a corn and soy farm in northern Iowa, and then he is now a soybean agronomist and associate professor at the University of Minnesota. His effort there is split between research in soybean production and physiology and extension activities throughout the north central U.S. and in pretty much anywhere where soybeans are grown in the U.S. Finally, in addition from our last seminar, we have Ryan Khoury, who has a background in agricultural economics and has more than a decade's experience in analyzing and reporting on agricultural markets, and right now is the director of economics at Mercaris, which is a leader in data and analytics of the organic and non-GMO commodity crops. Well, after that quick introduction, I am now going to hand it over to our host, Karen, to start with the panel. Karen.
All right, thanks, Pepe. So a lot has happened since we last spoke back in May. First things first, the USDA June survey. That was pretty surprising for a lot of people as the corn acres dropped about 5 million from the March survey to June, and that was way bigger than the market expected. And also soybean acres were not quite as large as analysts had thought. So we definitely saw more bullish numbers there with the acres in June. However, the corn stocks, they were pretty bearish. So we've been watching that corn supply heading into next year and trying to stay under 3 billion bushels is definitely, whether or not we're going to do that is becoming the question here. But we're still dealing with most likely record stocks, the highest stocks in at least 3 decades here in the U.S. for corn. So on the demand side, corn is still dealing with the issues from ethanol and the coronavirus and the reduced fuel demand. So as of now, or as of the latest week, production's still running about 12% below normal levels. And ethanol demand in general has been about 10% below normal levels for about a month now, because we haven't really seen a substantial rise in gas demand in the US for about a month. So that situation has stagnated in the last month. So that's something that we're going to keep looking out for. But USDA has reduced its corn for ethanol estimate for at least 1920 over the last several months. But export demand has been really, really great for the new crop, and that's for corn and soybeans. And as of this morning, USDA published the week ended July 30th, that sales week. And as of July 30th, we've sold 26 million tons of combined corn and soybeans for 2021. And that is the most for this date since at least 2008. My records didn't go back further than that. But after this, I'm going to check out the past years and I'll post on Twitter. But it is definitely very, very large. We have that going, and that's definitely kind of kept some of the excitement around the prospects for exports in the coming year. China has obviously been a very big part of that. They've come in and they've bought a record amount of corn. Their soybean purchases for next year are at 6-year highs. So we've seen that demand return as we had hoped. But now the hope is that we continue to see that and that we sell as much as we need to keep our stocks at the predicted levels. So one more thing that I want to touch on before we get going is the general market structure. So funds have been short corn for quite a while now, but they're not as short as they were kind of earlier in the growing season. But they haven't really changed their views too much in July. So they're still hanging out at that 130, 140, net short futures and options contract level. They had built a nice long in soybeans, actually, during this growing season. And back in June, funds actually had a record bullish bet on the soybean to corn spread, which is very unusual for the time of year. Now, that's come down, but that net long is still very much there. And the soybean bulls have definitely retreated a little bit since June, but that long is still there. So that's the market structure, heading into August. So without any further, background, let's get right into it. So we want to start talking about acreage. And Matt, I'm going to direct this question to you. So USDA's June acreage numbers definitely were surprising on corn. And normally weather is what drives, planting patterns in the spring, not prices. Was it different this time?
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. I mean, typically when you have a really good early spring, the general thing that we've seen in the past is that producers will plant more corn. The couple of things are going on here, though. We're seeing a lot more producers are actually starting with soybeans, first of all. And so if the weather and the conditions were good, you've got to assume maybe they're going to continue to plant soybeans. It's a little bit different dynamic, but more so, and I think way more intriguing has certainly just been this profitability discussion. And so, obviously neither corn nor beans were necessarily a home run by any stretch of the imagination, but at the same time, with the outlay of cash required to put a corn crop out, when the corn prices are languishing as they had been, and your spring price was $3.88 versus $4 last year, there's no question in my mind that producers took a look at that and said, hey, I'm going to have to back off just a shade. I was surprised that we were cleared out at 92. I'll be honest with you, but I did think that we would back off of what the planting intentions numbers were.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. And I think the last time that we spoke, the panel definitely was in agreement that we would see a reduction in those corn acres from March, but I don't think anybody expected to see the reduction that we did. So yes, as you're saying, prices definitely had more of a play than probably we've seen in any recent year. And I'm going to come back to you on that in a little bit. But I do want to get to Seth Seth, what is your opinion on how acreage decisions this spring, kind of in your area, were impacted by prices, or weather, or both?
I just have to second Matt on all those points. It's I think when we think about farmers, I think we just have to look at this from both the historical perspective and how little they make change in their operations from year to year. There's a real inertia. There's a real pretty much set on rotations, and very little happens. But then they surprise us. 19 surprised me terribly in that we had good corn prices and farmers kept planting corn. This year it was just the opposite, and I think it has to do with the immediacy of some of the credit issues on the farm, that farmers were carrying a lot of grain they hadn't sold, and things were just too tight. They just couldn't purchase that fertilizer at some fraction of the farmers, I should say. We have a real diverse population of farmers out there, and it could just be those few that had trouble putting a budget together, and their banker was a little bit tight on them in terms of their rotation and pushed them towards soybeans. So I just think that I think these things are always good. Good show interesting pictures of what it's like on the farm, and so I think it's a very good question, though.
Yeah, so to expand on that, I guess either Seth or Matt, this question would be for you. We definitely saw the corn profitability down, in addition to soybean profitability. I mean, neither of them were great, but I think we can see why the corn acres fell so much. But why didn't we then add more bean acres? I still think that's a little unclear.
Yeah, I can take that. I think as far as the bean acreage discussion is concerned, you've got to think that a producer, for the most part, I think the last few years, you've seen, like a state like Illinois, I think 5 out of the last 6 years, profit margins were better for soybeans than what they were for corn, which, if you'd have told me that 8 or 9 years ago, I'd have said, you're crazy if we're going to see a stretch like this. And so I think producers certainly have grown more akin to planting soybeans, first of all. Second of all, these soybean yields the last few years have just been really interesting. And so when a producer starts to plug in some of the yields they feel like they might be able to garner, actually soybean profitability doesn't look all that bad. And so I think whenever you were comparing the two, even though bean prices weren't necessarily all that rosy to look at, profitability using what I would say is a more current yield projection certainly put a producer in a little bit better position maybe to push soybean acres than what they have in the past.
And I would just add to Karen's question
go ahead.
Real quick. I mean, I think those corn plus soybean acres should be stable. And if those aren't coming out set, then I think we have to question some of the numbers personally, because I don't know where those acres are going. Certainly they were planted to something, and I don't think they were going into oat or wheat. So I think they had to be planted into something.
I'm going to return to that discussion action a little bit, but I think that this is a good time to bring in Ryan to give a perspective on the organic corn and soybean acres. So I want to ask you, Ryan, how are organic corn and soybean acres this year different from prior years? And then do you think that because of the low price environment that we have in general for corn and soybeans, do you think that any traditional growers have maybe opted to go for more profitability on the organic side?
Yeah, maybe to answer the last question first, in terms of the incentive to transition to organic as a result of prices, it is true that the organic sector has seen significant premiums over conventional crops for many years now, and this year is no different. It's a little hard to make that decision on a dime, though, because that's a 3-year process. So if you're facing lower commodity prices this year, you couldn't just decide to raise an organic crop. You could look at something like maybe non-GMO, but you couldn't that quickly transition into organic. Looking at kind of how we're looking at the picture overall shaping up, The planting decisions within organic are a little bit different and motivated by a little bit different factors than what you see in the conventional market, because crop rotation is such a big factor. That and the pricing differential between the organic crops that you can grow is a big factor. So really what we look at when we're trying to understand what our organic crops might look like is we look at, number one, how many new operations do we have certified for organic this year? And the reason that that's important is a lot of farmers will grow organic crop as their first crop out of, because organic corn is the most profitable per acre by far. And with that, this year we're looking at about 1,800 new certified organic farms as of July. That number gets built up throughout the year. Those numbers aren't due until actually January of 2021, so we don't have a full picture of just how many new farms we have until then. But based on that, the trend that we're seeing right now is we're definitely seeing growth in the number of organic farmers. And that actually led to a much bigger crop last year, a corn crop, than we were expecting. So if we continue to see that trend, more farmers coming in, we saw much better planting this year than we had last year. And, if we see, one of the other factors we saw last year is on a per operation basis, the number of corn acres get planted was down 10%. So if you get a recovery on those operations and you get more farms coming in, we could be talking somewhere from 8 to 10% more organic corn acres harvested this year than we saw last year, which would put us at a record number of organic corn acres harvested. If you're looking at soybeans are a little bit different. They tend not to be a crop. And the reason for that is the price premium is not quite as good, and the yield drags a little more for organic soybeans. That agronomically, they're a little harder to manage. Organic. That so far we've seen through July, basically 2% increase on the number of certified organic operations that are going to be harvesting soybeans this year. And on top of that, kind of like what we saw in corn, I think what is my number? We saw about 5% lower, harvested acres per operation last year. That 2%, 5%, that could spell 7 to 10% more soybean acres harvested this year. So if you kind of take what you have with more acres with corn and more acres with soybean, we're definitely looking at a bigger crop, especially if yields continue to look as good as they are.
Yeah, no, I definitely had forgotten about how you can't jump into organic production right away, that it does take a few years to get into that. But we have been discussing over the last few years how farm incomes have been falling. So I would maybe suspect that partially might have driven some producers over the last couple of years, potentially towards that organic side or non-GMO side. I'm going to get back to you, Ryan, in a little bit when we talk about because I want to talk about how the organic yields respond to the weather when we get to that discussion. But I want to switch back to traditional acres for a second, because while we're going to get USDA's yield forecast next week, that's the thing that everybody their primary focus every August 12th or whatever. But we also do get that acreage registration data from FSA, the Farm Service Agency, from USDA. And so this is the first time we'll get that data set, and then each month it will, be more updated until the final form in January. And that FSA data shows us kind of the acreage distribution, and also will inform us on stuff like tree-vented acres. So when you look at the principal planted acres in the June report, you're about 16 to 17 million fewer principal planted acres than, say, the average 2016, 17, 18. So that's significant. I know it's about the lowest, the first year, well, aside from 2019, I want to say it's the lowest in the last 15 at least years. So let me ask you, Pepe, and then I'll ask the other panelists too. Where did those acres go? Where are they?
That's a $1 million question. That's a really, really good point. Because we also saw expected declines in other crops that we were expecting to still have fairly decent acreage, like cotton or sorghum. So that's going to be a really interesting interesting thing to look into. Again, I think this is something related to what Seth and Matt started discussing initially about what might be the different process of decision making that farmers are doing that we've seen slightly change from what we've seen in seasons past when they would stick very hard to some of these rotations. It's going to be an interesting one. And again, I think the FSA crop acreage data in August is going to start giving us a good indication for that. For a reminder of a lot of those folks that are not too familiar with it, as you were saying before, this is a data set's released in conjunction with crop production. And it starts in August and goes every month, released the same day as the crop production reports. And it's basically all the registered acres in government programs. So it's a hard number. That data, as you were saying, gets collected and processed as the season goes along and as the FSA receives the data from farmers, so that each report will see higher numbers for all of them. So I think it's important to think about the numbers that are going to come out as a good floor that will be able to tell us really how low initially those numbers that we saw that surprised us all for corn and soybeans might actually be. I think it's also, important to know that the June acreage figures that we saw can still vary from now to final. So it is possible that we will see potentially more corn acres than what USDA came out initially. And again, the FSA data set is a good tool to do that. In fact, NASS itself uses it in its forecasting process throughout the year. They typically tend to wait till October when that data is a bit more mature than it will be in August, because as I said before, that data gets collected and collated and analyzed by the FSA and released to NASS on a rolling basis every week. It will be interesting this year to see if we see a bit of delays in the data collection and processing of the data. So it is possible because of closures of the FSA offices that process, that the data that we'll see released will be not as mature as it usually is for August. We don't have official information on that yet, but that would be one thing that we would have to be careful with when we look at the new FSA numbers that are coming out. But no, I'd be really curious to hear where Matt thinks and where Seth think these acres went.
Yeah, so Seth, I want to direct this question at you. So you were earlier saying that when we were talking about the decline in corn acres and the not so large increase in soybean acres, and you were saying that the acres must have gone somewhere. They must have been planted to somewhere. But so I'm going to ask you. So are these 16 to 17 odd million acres that have disappeared? Are they idle? Did they go to prevent? And if they were planted to another crop, in your opinion, what is your best guess of where those acres were planted?
Yeah, I don't think I'm going to be able to help on any three of those questions for you. I don't know the answers to any of those. Those are, as Pepe mentioned, that's $1 million question. I don't know where those went. As you're speaking, it reminds me of that old joke about we spill more beer than most companies make, right? And so I think that's where we're at. We're at rounding error with this. There's some issues with the accounting, and I don't know where these are going. In another year, I would have said that we've got prevent plant built into this, and the FSA would have come out with some really interesting numbers on how much prevent plant we had. But I don't see that making up any significant piece of this year. We just didn't have those kind of conditions. Last year, it would have been very obvious to us, but I don't know where that would come in. So I don't think to me, the FSA number isn't particularly that interesting to me unless we can, it makes more sense than what we got from USDA.
Okay, Matt, so the same question to you. Maybe you can give a guess, if possible, where these acres have been planted to, or if you think that they're prevented, idled. Yeah, just let us know.
Okay, so three things come to mind. First of all, when profit margins are historically low, you tend to lose principal crop acres. Are you going to lose 16 million acres? No, I don't believe so. And so, I agree with Seth that, you lose all those corn acres, your expectation would be that the soybean acreage would have been much higher than essentially what we all thought they were going to be all along, maybe 500,000 over. I think 83, we went up to 83 and a half. If you would have told me that corn was going to be down at 92, I'd have said beans would be 86 and a half or 87. That didn't happen to be the case. Now, I would tell you right here in central Illinois, there are a handful of preventative plant acres that are literally bordering fields that are going to be 250 bushel plus corn. So what am I saying? I think there was a few acres that producers took a look at the supply or the economics, I guess, of that preventative plant situation versus going ahead and planting corn, and thought that it was advantageous to them to lay out a few acres. Now, is that what they told the USDA in the survey? Most likely, yeah, I'm not going to plant corn, I think is what happened to an extent. Now, again, I agree with everyone on here with the general theme that some of these acres are essentially have been planted and we just didn't find out about them. Do I expect that we're going to go from 92 back to 96 or 7 on corn? No, but I could see us ending up kind of like Pepe alluded to with this corn acreage number actually maybe growing just a little bit on down the road. I think it'll be interesting to see. Obviously, we didn't have the weather issues we had a year ago, but I do think there are some prevent plant acres, and I do think some acres exited because of lack of profitability.
Yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense, Matt. I do have to actually correct myself. So the 16 to 17 million, that was last year. I was reading the wrong line. This year it's more like 8 to 10, but I was not mistaken when I said that it was, aside from last year, by far the lowest in the last 15 or 10 or 15 years, whatever it was. But we're still talking 8 to 10 million, and that is a lot of acres to not know where they've gone. So my apologies, I misspoke, but I just wanted to make sure that we get the correct number out there. I want to move on to yields now, because I think that there's a good discussion to have around that, especially since we've had some interesting weather patterns. We were a little dry in June, kind of some heat. July was not the best for all places, but in other places it was great. So I guess maybe Pepe, I'll direct this question to you first, and then Seth and Matt, you can jump in. Do you think that given the weather now, are we still on pace for record yields? And where do you think the problem spots really are right now?
Actually, Karen, before I take your question, why don't we do something and let the audience first give us a quick little vote on where they are seeing creep. So if everyone tuned in can go to our live poll and select a question and hit submit, we will poll everyone before we start discussing our own perspectives on yields. And then towards the end of the presentation, we can come back and take a look at the results. Yes, I think I'll get started, and I'm going to leave the poll up for just a second. I agree completely with what Karen had been describing. I think overall sowings, as we know, started pretty well. Planting pace was not super fast, not super slow, but generally overall pretty well. And despite some issues with weather in June, in several places, issues with lingering dryness, and then some scares in July with the potential for big heat waves that, fortunately for farmers, did not end up materializing. Conditions overall remain quite well. Okay, so I'm going to now put on the slide, everyone, for you to give us your opinion on soybean yield. So again, I'll also give you about a minute there to answer. Yeah, I think overall, really, we are steadily on track for very, very, very high yields for both crops.
What about Matt or Seth? Matt, how about you first, and then we'll go to Seth. So Pepe kind of talked about we're on pace for record yields, and given that you agree with that, can you answer where do you think the problem areas are? And I know that you're going to say Western Iowa, and I want you to touch on that, but I want you to point out if there are any other besides Western Iowa, because I think that's the one that kind of stands out to everyone right now. Are there any other places we could be concerned about?
I think that that is the one that I am most concerned about, just due to the sheer production and then obviously the usage of corn out of that sector. I think that whenever you compare, for instance, the size of the issue as compared to how much production actually comes out of there, is something we have to keep a close eye on. You hear about a few pockets here and there. I'm hearing about the Western Plains getting a little bit dry. Obviously, the production isn't as robust as what we would be looking at for Iowa, especially in the western part. I think west of Des Moines up into north central Iowa, there's certainly some extremely dry areas. But those areas, even in the state of Iowa, I've got to think are going to be mitigated to an extent, because I think there's a pretty good chunk of Iowa, especially east of Des Moines, a good chunk of the eastern part of the state, that production is going to be rather large. And so I do think there'll be some very big yields coming out of that part of the state. And so it's going to be very interesting to see how this all kind of averages out. I think, I don't know if you want a yield number or not, or if we haven't quite got there yet. I don't see the results on here, but right now we're actually thinking that the USDA is going to come in pretty hot in August, maybe around 180, 82, 183. So I don't know if that's way too large, but I do know in 2018 they were 181 right out of the gate in August. That would have been about 5 to 6 bushel above trend. I don't know that they can come in quite that large, but we're at very similar good to excellent conditions as what we saw in 2018.
Well, I'm happy to. Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry. No.
Sorry about that.
So before we get to you, I just wanted to remind everybody that when the USDA publishes that August yield, and then the subsequent ones, like the August one, though, especially, that's based on survey. So that's farmers telling USDA what they think of their yields. That's not USDA just running some other model and coming up with a number themselves. That is directly what farmers have told them, adjusted for, historical data. But again, it's what farmers have told them, not what USDA has come up with independently. And I think that is an important distinction to make when we talk about these August numbers and beyond. So Seth, can I get your opinion there on the problem areas, or, chances for record yield, or if you want to give a yield number?
Yeah, I guess let's start on the positive. I think these, the very, very extreme northwest part of the Corn Belt, North Dakota, is suffered by too much rain early and continued. The Red River Valley's just been flooded all summer, so we've got a lot of corn and soybeans in that area. We're gonna have very low yields in those areas. There's a lot of acres, but then you get into South Dakota, southern Minnesota, Wisconsin, and then maybe even into Michigan. We've got, for sure record yields in those, for both corn and soybeans in those regions at least, if not states. Western Iowa is really, really hurting. So, Matt really hit on it. The question is Eastern Iowa going to make up for it? And I guess from a little bit on the analytics side, looking at planting progress, Iowa, Minnesota, South Dakota had very early planting, record early planting, and that helps us when we have good conditions late. It doesn't help us when we dry out. So I would say that Minnesota and South Dakota are going to take advantage of that early planting, and that's going to make our yields. Eastern Iowa is going to take advantage of it, and they're going to have 200 plus bushel yields throughout all of Eastern Iowa. But the question is Western Iowa 120 or 90 bushel yields in some of those fields? So I think that's really where it comes down is how much that drags us down, because that yield is gone already in Western Minnesota or Western Iowa. So we can identify that. The rest of the Corn Belt, of course, especially on the soybean side, is going to be dependent on weather from here on out. But we're set up across, 7 of the top 8 states for record yields, at least three record yields, and another 5 or 6 of those states are going to be way above trend line for probably both corn and soybeans.
Yeah, so I want to talk about. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Kevin,
yeah,
you
sorry.
go ahead.
Let me just jump in before to weigh in on the slightly more, maybe slightly less optimistic, but still very high side as well. Our recent estimates, again, I can't disagree with anything that Seth or Matt have said to date. I think conditions are going to put us in record territory for both crops. Our current estimate is putting us a little bit on the lower side of that record. Although I will say satellite imagery that came in today has already bumped up our modeled results a bit more than what I'm going to show you today. But nationally, again, conditions extremely well. In addition to what others have said, there are also some parts of the Eastern Corn Belt that have been seeing just kind of a nagging, persistent, slightly moderate to mild dryness throughout most of the season that have also, I think, could ding yields in some areas. And of course, in some somewhat smaller producing areas like the Texas Panhandle for corn, that will lower things a little bit. But overall, there's potential definitely to breach the 180 or reach up to some of the higher numbers that are out there. And I think pretty much not too much to add for soybean either. While our number nationally is at 51.6 right now, satellite imagery that came in today is already putting that number higher and into record territory. And, in addition to everything that's been discussed, and maybe Seth can add a little bit there on soybeans in the Delta, conditions there in places like southeastern Arkansas or parts of eastern Arkansas, northeastern Louisiana are also looking very, very good. So again, there's very likely a new record for both of them on the cards.
Okay, let's get back to the yield discussion in terms of how lower prices have maybe influenced some of those decisions. But I want to take one small detour first, and I'm going to start with you, Matt, because last time we spoke back in May, we were talking about how critically undersold U.S. farmers were on their new crop corn and soybeans. Matt, can you update us? Where are they at now? Had they sped up on sales? Are they still well behind previous years? What's the situation?
From the elevator systems that we talk to, which with John Stewart Associates, who we broker with Ag Market, it's an expansive list of elevator systems, very undersold as compared to normal. And so the rally that we received over the summer obviously was quite short-lived, maybe not the percentage people were looking for. When you're this far below crop insurance price on corn, it's tough to make that decision, especially if you're a producer and you don't know what your production is going to be. I mean, that could be a catastrophic decision to make that sale and then to see the market skyrocket and you not still raise the bushels. I mean, that would just be a bad deal. And so it's handcuffed producers, especially on the corn side. Now, I don't feel like we've got near the excuse, if you will, on soybeans. I mean, I'm a producer as well, so I'm not trying to pick on producers. I feel like a lot of times we struggle, obviously, with the emotional decision of making sales. But, I think with soybeans, you haven't been near as far in the crop insurance price. And as this crop has grown and as we've gotten really good rainfall in some parts of the Midwest, I think it would be advantageous for producers to at least run their production times the price that they can receive, because 10 bushel more an acre makes one heck of a difference. But yeah, I think they're way undersold. I can't give you a percentage. I just know that from what the elevators we talked to, they should have a lot more sold than what they have going into harvest.
Okay, Matt, thanks for that. Back to our discussion about budgets and low prices. I'm going to get to you, Seth. Do you think that farmers this year, given the low price environment, have maybe skipped over some of those inputs that they might normally use, such as fungicide, insecticide, anything like that? Do you feel like that has that has been a theme this year? And do you feel like that is enough to impact yields? If so.
Well, I'd start at the end of that, and I'd say no. I don't think we've, those additional inputs that farmers would make on top of this crop, those additional investments, if you will, beyond fertilizer, are not going to add enough that anybody would find that even if there was significant changes. The benefits of fungicide on these crops is very marginal. I mean, I think the better question is, have farmers changed their behavior based on the economics? And we're shocked. The elevators are still moving a lot of fungicide. So it seems to me that farmers understand yield is driving their overall profits. They understand that they need to get the highest yield they possibly can on these acres. So I think they're skipping that new John Deere X9 combine for this year, but they're going to continue to put on their fungicide. So I think it's those big purchases that they've moved over, but they're continuing to put the inputs back on the crop. So I don't think that's an issue.
Okay, Matt, do you generally agree with that? Have you seen farmers, bypassing fungicide, insecticide, given this year's low prices?
That's a good question. And I'd say in my area, what we've seen is that most producers have sprayed a very large percentage of their soybean acres. Whereas we've seen a lot of planes run in the last few years, both on corn and beans, we're seeing a lot more ground application for soybeans. Whereas maybe they were sprayed for dicamba 4 to 6 weeks ago, producers are asking them, saving $5 an acre, but they're still putting on the fungicide and insecticide. I think it's more hybrid specific with corn. I agree with Seth. There's a lot of fungicide being applied, but I think on soybeans, it's a much higher percentage of the acres. Whereas on corn, I think it's hybrid specific. And that's exactly what we did on our operation. If you're going to spend what we're paying in this area is around $30 an acre for corn to spray fungicide, obviously you need about 10 bushels. And so, the research doesn't suggest that a predominant majority of hybrids, are going to return 10 bushel an acre. So I think producers have been a little more hesitant on corn.
Yeah, that makes sense. Both Matt and Seth, you've offered good perspectives on that. Let's flip over to organic really quick. And Ryan, I want to ask you, how has the weather been this year for organic corn and soybeans? And do the organic crops respond well, or do they respond differently, I guess, than to certain weather conditions than the traditional crops?
Yeah, organic corn and organic soybeans grow in the same sunshine and rain as everything else, right? So good weather's good and bad weather's bad. The one difference that you do see between conventional and organic production is organic crops tend not to fare as badly during bad times, and as a result, you tend not to see quite as big jump back during good times. They tend to stay a little more stable because there is more organic matter in the soil, and they do use more cover crops. The other thing that we're kind of watching going on with organic yields is kind of the areas we are worried about and where we are not worried about are a little bit different maybe than where you might be in the conventional market. If you're talking about Iowa, how rough things are looking there, we definitely have some organic producers in the western part of Iowa. However, the majority of your organic corn and soybeans within Iowa is grown in the eastern and in the southern section of Iowa. So I think what we're going to see across that state is the good's going to outweigh the bad, and I think overall Iowa's going to be better on organic than it was last year, and it's going to have a really good crop and pretty good yield. Kind of the same points everybody else was talking about, South Dakota, Minnesota, Michigan, they all look pretty good. Indiana, Iowa, Illinois. The places that we're actually a little more worried about are if you get further east. The organic sector does have a pretty good share of its crops in Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York. Those are pretty large areas for organic production. And then the dryness there, we could see that impact yields in terms of, we're looking to be higher than where we were last year, but we're probably not going to hit record levels. And then if we look down into Texas, the Texas Panhandle, and into Oklahoma, that dry condition there that's really set in, I think that could be a pretty substantial issue. And really, whenever you're looking at that part of the country, it's really organic dairy has expanded in that area over the past 4 years, 5 years. And as a result, we've seen a pretty good increase in organic corn production and organic fodder type of feed, for organic dairy. And with the dry conditions there, we could see that crop turn out pretty poor. And, once you get into harvest, that could result in some demand getting pulled down in that direction. But, setting the fistful of bad places we have aside, yeah, I think in organics, we're looking at, record crop yields for organic corn easily. I wouldn't be surprised if we hit 124 to 125 a bushel on organic corn. And then looking at soybeans, I don't know that we'll hit a record. We had some pretty good crops about 2 years ago that I don't know that we'll hit quite that level. But for a national average, I'm looking somewhere around 36 bushels per acre is where I think organic soybeans are going to wind up. So on both cases, a pretty good recovery from last year. And I think organic corn will probably hit record yields, but there's definitely going to be some pockets where we have some issues, particularly once you start to get down in the Southwest and once you get further east.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. That's actually really interesting to hear kind of what a record organic corn and soybean yield would be versus, artificial corn and soybean. Definitely interesting to compare. Yeah. And so, like you said, the organic crops seem to respond, similarly to the traditional corn and soybeans. So obviously August is going to be very important for those crops as it is for especially soybeans. August is that month that you really get to see the rainfall. So Pepe, do you think that August is looking wet? Is it looking hot, cool? And do we think that that is a good forecast that's going to continue to support these record yield outlooks?
Yeah, sure thing. So I had the pleasure of chatting with Isaac Hanks, who joined us last time to discuss weather earlier today. And, overall conditions in August are still looking pretty good. After a continuation of the cold spell that we're seeing across the Midwest right now that will continue for the next few days, we'll start seeing rounds of warmth come through the plains in the Midwest throughout probably the next 10 to 15 days, which will bring to some parts of the corn and soy belts deviations up to 6 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit above average. But that's only in some areas of the plains, not in any of the major producing areas. But in places like, Kansas, portions of North Dakota. The good thing is that these bouts of warmth will come in and will be interspersed with near normal to slightly cool weather. So we're not really seeing anything too extreme in either direction at this point. There is potential for some nagging dryness to develop in portions of the southern plains in Kansas. However, essentially every major grain and oilseed producing area should see some degree of rainfall through the rest of the month. So major yield packs are not expected at this point. However, I think we have to be really careful with that. As Matt and Seth talked about earlier, there are some really big producing areas that are quite. The U.S. Crop Drought Monitor released its latest map this morning, and in it we can see some areas of very severe dryness developing in western Iowa that, again, will certainly ding yields and continue to impact, especially probably a bit more soybeans than corn, as you were alluding to before. So I think it's something that we really do need to monitor closely. And now beyond that time frame, so beyond that, there's, that time frame is always a bit more uncertain towards the end of the month and into early September. There is a bit of a chance for an active to hyperactive period of Atlantic tropical activity. But there aren't any signals that will bring weather extremes with that. And I think beyond that into the harvest window, it does seem to be a slight lean towards having a cool, wet conditions September through November, which could impact some of the very late planted areas that are still developing, and could impact harvest slightly. However, again, there's lots of uncertainty at that time of the year. But for that, Isaac and the weather team are going to have a webinar on September 17th. Well, they'll talk a lot more about this and what's happening in other areas of the world. So I would encourage everyone to tune in for that one. But in reality, I don't see anything too significant with the potential to really drop yields below what we've discussed today.
Yeah, so it does sound like we are on track for those record yields if the August forecast does hold up. We've gotten a few questions in, and we'll try to get to those with the time that we have left. One of the questions that came in was regarding what I said about the August yield, USDA's August yield. So that in August, NAS's yield numbers are based on survey and satellite data, mostly. But I have spoken with Lance Honig, the chief of the crops branch at NAS, and he says that the survey is the predominant factor in those August yields. So in 2019, for the first time, USDA eliminated objective yield data for corn and soybeans. So that first objective yield count will come in September, and that started last year. So this number is going to be largely based on the farmer survey. So I just wanted to clear that up. And I don't know if Pepe, you had anything else to add to that, or if you wanted to get to any of our other questions.
Yeah, no, very briefly. That's right. The August yield survey was scraped. So for this first forecast, NAS will weigh the surveys and what they call other covariates, so including satellite imagery data, weather data, information that they also develop from the U.S. Drought Monitor in their forecast. What's interesting is what we see, the pattern, based on discussions that I've had with some of their statisticians who've developed the models that they use to support their decision-making on yields, is that throughout the season, they have the sources of information that we've discussed, the farmer surveys where they just ask them directly what yields will be on their farms, the objective yield surveys, and then this weather modeled, these weather and satellite imagery factors. Throughout the season, the weightings of those different factors vary. But the big story is basically for all of the crops that they develop forecasts for, as the season goes along, the surveys tend to have increasing weight as we reach the final estimates at the expense of some of the weather data or the objective yield data as well. That will wane towards the final number. But that's just a big overview of how they get to those numbers.
Okay, Pepe, did we show the results of the poll?
No, I think it's a perfect time to do that. Let's take a look at what people are thinking. All right, not a bad set of numbers. Most folks are still a bit more cautious on the big numbers that we're seeing there, but certainly everyone is looking at things that will be probably record for corn, at least. We haven't taken a look. Any reaction, Matt, Seth, Ryan?
I'm not surprised here. I know Karen posted a Twitter poll, and I posted a very similar one, and the results were above 180 predominantly. The really high yields, 183 plus. I didn't get very many people, but there was a few. And so I do think there's still some folks out there that think that this could be, by a large sum, a record yield. But, at the same time, I think some of the problem areas we've talked about are maybe taking a little bit of a shine off that conversation. But having the first 180 national yield looks a little more likely every day right now, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. Matt, any feedback there?
Seth, you want?
Oh, sorry. I meant to say Seth. Sorry.
That's fine.
No, it fits with what I've been thinking too. So I think, and what I've been talking to folks about. So it fits.
Gotcha. Well, let's take a quick look at soybeans. Also, slightly more cautious as well with the big yields, but certainly numbers that look to be record. Is that in line with what you're seeing for soybeans, Seth?
I think so, based on what I talked about early planting and then these conditions. But, again, we just have to remember that soybeans, there's more, there's more hanging out there in terms of weather. I guess the one thing I would want to mention physiologically about soybean that most people don't think about is these large canopies that we produce. That does give us a little bit of a buffer. So if we have these soybeans that are shoulder high, that does help us a little bit, even if things dry out a little bit. That's yield in the bank for us. So that does help us in some of those areas.
Okay, I think that we have just a couple more minutes here. Actually, we have a couple of questions, and this is not related to our discussion at all right now, but I know that I've been getting a lot of questions about it, and people have been talking a lot about it. So I don't know if any of our panelists have any thoughts on this, but the Three Gorges dam flooding in China and all the issues that they've had there with their flooding, do we think that some of their increased demand for U.S. corn and soybeans, is that related to anything that we've seen in China with the flooding issues? Or maybe said another way, how do we see those flooding issues impacting kind of our global agriculture markets? Anyone have any thoughts on that? It's okay.
I would say, I think that the flooding for the most part has been south of the main agricultural areas. And so I don't know that the increased demand has a lot to do with the flooding. I'm going to say that it has some. I mean, it definitely moved into the northern part of China where, more of the production would be, but they didn't have as intense and severe flooding as what they did, in the farther south area where the dam was afraid to be compromised. I think that, when you look at China auctioning off corn, like 35 to 40 million tons of corn since the month of May, every single bushel has been sold. And you look at interior corn prices in China are record high. It tells me China likes to have security based upon their stocks and their reserves. And I feel very strongly that, that has a lot to do with what their purchases have been so far. And it probably leads me to believe that they're certainly going to be purchasing more, in future months. So, I think that a lot of this has to do with the fact that, that they're using quite a bit more corn than what they're producing, on the corn side of things. As far as soybeans are concerned, they've been a huge consumer of soybeans for several years now. I know there's a lot of questions after ASF on what they would be able to do for purchase on beans or bean meal, but bottom line is they've rebuilt much quicker, I think, than what some people assumed they would. Brazil is running out of beans, quite frankly, to export because they had exported so many beans, in the May-June time frame. So I've got to think that the U.S. is still in really good shape there as well.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, Matt, about the corn auctions, because China's been auctioning off a ton of corn, and it's very, very rare. You never see 100% of the offering, being bought. And that's been going on now for since that they started doing that in May. So that's a really interesting trend to keep watching. And those prices, yeah, that's definitely a sign, if anything. So yeah, definitely, no lack of interest in terms of what's going on in China. Pepe, I guess I'll turn it back over to you if there's time for any more questions, or if you want to wrap it up.
I think we're just about on time now, so we might have to wrap it up. If there are any questions that remain, we will get back to you via email. But again, I really just wanted to thank everyone for joining, all of our panelists, you for taking all the hard work of moderating. As we said at the beginning, we will email the webinar recording, the slide deck to all the registrants. There will also be a survey pop-up, so please complete it just to get your ideas on how useful these are. We'd really appreciate the feedback. And then really just stay tuned for future webcasts from our team here. I know Karen, Matt are really active on Twitter, so take a look at what they're posting, and have a great rest of the day and stay tuned.